On behalf of the Center for Buddhist Studies, I want to welcome all of you to this conference on Tibetan religion and the state in the 17th and 18th centuries. While the conference is being hosted by the Center for Buddhist Studies, I should point out that the idea for this conference came from two visitors to Berkeley, Brian Cuevas, who is our Freeman Visiting Professor for the year, and Ben Bogan, our Mellon Postdoctoral Fellow in the group in Buddhist Studies. And it's terribly generous of them to devote their time during their stay here to putting this conference together, and on behalf of us all, I want to thank them. Sponsoring a conference on Tibetan history seemed particularly auspicious as the group in Buddhist Studies, which is the unit at Berkeley that oversees the Buddhist Studies PhD program. We've been trying to build in the area of Tibetan Buddhism for the past several years. And we now have modern and classical Tibetan language sequence on the books taught by our able lecturer Karma Nogup. And with the help of the Kensei Foundation, we're working toward having a permanent faculty line in Tibetan Buddhism in the not too distant future, we hope. In the meantime, we're able to offer a slate of undergraduate and graduate courses with the help of visitors such as Brian and Ben this year, and Christian Luxanitz, who's graced us with his presence last year and is here again now. So the topic of the conference suggested by Brian and Ben was also apropos. There's a tremendous interest in Tibetan religion and culture, as we all know, but there's relatively little, I think, appreciation or understanding of Tibetan history, and particularly Tibetan history in the early modern period. And this period is obviously crucial to our understanding of what is happening in Tibet and in Sino-Tibetan relations today. So again, I thank all of the participants in advance for their contribution to this event. Now, I want to mention that in addition to the Center for Buddhist Studies, funding for this event was provided by the Institute of East Asian Studies, the Center for Chinese Studies, and the Townsend Center for the Humanities. And finally, I'd like to point out that the Berkeley Center for Buddhist Studies was inaugurated less than 2 years ago. Yet in this short period of time, we've run a total of 6 conferences and workshops and well over a dozen colloquia. And this flurry of programming would not have been possible without the able oversight of our administrative staff, the Vice Chair of the Center, Kaya Sert, and her assistant, Liz Gregg. Now I'd like to introduce Ben Bogan, the Mellon Postdoctoral Fellow in the group in Buddhist Studies, who will introduce this evening's speaker, Professor Terrence Shaka. Ben, where are you?
Thank you, Professor Scharf, for hosting both Brian and myself and for bringing all of this together. And I'm very delighted to have all of the conference participants who will be here in the next few days, guests who have come for tonight's lecture, and most of all, our distinguished speaker, Professor Terrence Shaka. Terrence Shaka is a world-renowned and widely published scholar on both historic and contemporary Tibet. He presently holds the Canadian Research Chair in Religion and Contemporary Society in Asia at the University of British Columbia. He was born in Lhasa in the tumultuous year of 1959. Shortly after that, he left Tibet as a child and spent his youth in India with his family before winning a scholarship to study in the United Kingdom, where he enrolled at the London University School of Oriental and African Studies, where he eventually wrote his doctoral thesis on the emergence of modern Tibetan literature since 1950. Since that time, Professor Shaka has published a number of groundbreaking books and articles on modern Tibet. His most expansive work to date, The Dragon in the Land of Snows, A History of Modern Tibet since 1947, was heralded by the New York Times as the definitive history of modern Tibet, and by the UK's Sunday Telegraph as a prodigious work of scholarship. And the book has received wide recognition as well as critical acclaim, and is now regarded as a standard text on the history of modern Tibet. Today, we asked Professor Shaka to come and speak on the question of Tibet, does history matter? And our goal in doing this was to take someone who's provided a very fresh and inspiring voice in the field of Tibetan studies, and someone who's really been able to take raise new questions about the modern period in Tibetan history, and approach the subject of Tibetan history from angles that were sometimes missed in the study of Tibetan Buddhism, raising questions about Tibetan society and literature and changes that have happened in modern times. And in particular, we thought it would be a very helpful beginning to our conversations over the next few days to have Professor Shaka reflect on the importance of history for Tibet in its current state, which, as we know, history is contested in the Tibetan context in a way that it is perhaps not in other fields and areas of the world. So with that, I'd like to welcome Professor Terrence Shaka. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm really sort of honored to be here to speak in front of such a distinguished gathering of academics, and I feel really intimidated and daunted to speak in front of Jean and Janet and Tim and Curtis and all who knows far more about Tibetan history than I do. You know, what I do is seems very simple compared to what is the work that you have done. But nevertheless, I have one advantage in that sense, that being raised and born, being in the part of that history which you study, I'm a product of that history. So in a way, I have sort of have some intimacy with that history. It is my sort of professional interest in Tibetan history really does not stem from wanting about Tibetan history. Actually, when I went to England, I was fascinated with the Tudor history. And I really find the English history so fascinating. Actually, I still, most of my spare time, I read English history more, because actually I know far more about the British English history than about Tibet. Because I find England is one of the most fascinating country in terms of history. Because, you know, currently, last few years, there was a debate about fox hunting, whether fox hunting should be banned or not. When you look, they debated over 300 years and only came to decision a year ago. And that's what I find it amazing about the English, you know, in history. That's what I like, the English sort of peaceful, evolutionary way English sort of adapts and changes. And that's what I admire. You know, they don't chop up kings' heads and, you know, have a revolution and change street names. You know, you find the street names in England the same as it was in the 12th century. You know, you in France and Germany, they have revolution and chop up king's head and things, and they start something new. And this is the sort of model adopted by the rest of the world, with the sort of inspired by revolutions. But I find English sort of very tame and gentle, and they get things right at the end. You know, they do muddle way through, but they get it right. So I liked English history. That's what so really my attraction to how did England evolve? How did they manage this little tiny island in the Atlantic, you know, manage to become the world power? So in that sense, I sort of got interested in history, and somehow when I went to university, I decided to look at the Asian history and history later of Tibet as an interest. But today I've been asked to speak about a question which is very complex, at the same time very interesting. And the question, does history matter, can be asked of all nations and all people and all societies. We can say, does American history matter, or the British? The proposition, does history matter, have waxed many scholars and thinkers who are far more qualified to speak on this rhetorical and philosophical question. I suppose I'm being asked to speak on this because of the prefix Tibet to this question. When we look in Tibet in context, does Tibetan history matter? Then, of course, we need to ask, who does it matter to? Does Tibetan history matter to the Tibetans? Does Tibetan history matter to the world? You know, basically, history matters to those who are the product of that history. And that seems rather a sort of bland answer. After all, Tibet past is not of great issue of concern to the citizens of the world. We cannot say any major events in the world can be understood if we know history of Tibet. So history of Tibet is interest, a sort of local interest to those who are product of it or those who are professionally interested in the subject. When we look at any world textbooks on history, we hardly ever find mention of Tibet. In the sort of grand historical works of Fernand Braudel on his civilization of capitalism in 15th to 18th century, which is a really amazing historical work which traces the events and ideas that shape the modern world. Tibet is only mentioned in passing as its reference was, it's a practice, a peculiar form of feudal practice he calls wula. And that was the only sort of footnote that exists in that book. That is the grand history of Tibet. So in the sort of world history, Tibet really only deserves a footnote, it seems to some people. Even if we address the question differently, ask, does Tibet's history or social formation have anything to teach the world about human condition and the evolution of history? Of course, we Tibetans like to think that we gave the world the Buddhism. You know, we are the custodian of Buddhism. And this current sort of interest, popular interest in Buddhism is sort of a Tibetan gift to the world. Of course, you know, rationalist historians will dismiss this as sort of voice of New Age sentimentality. So in this sort of larger context, it's really very hard to think about what does Tibetan history relates in terms of the world and the stage. Hugh Trevor-Roper, the Regis Professor of History at Oxford, once remarked that the only history that matters is history of Europe. When he made this pronouncement, he was speaking about Africa, and went on to say there's only history of Europeans in Africa and rest is darkness. The statement is not a simple racist pronouncement. What Hugh Trevor-Roper was pretending was that the history as field and discipline is about discovering how we have come to be where we are. The world is today entirely dominated by Western worldview, technological inventions, various forms of Western political ideologies. It is only through understanding of history of the West we will have some comprehension of where we are today. I don't think many of us would agree that the only history that matters is the history of the West. But still, the idea that history of the prevailing hegemonic power is the only thing that matters is still very strong and persists. In fact, after the fall of Soviet Union and the annihilation of Marxism as an ideological force and the triumph of capitalism and the liberal orthodoxy, seems to have given new impotence to the idea that the history is all about history of the victor. This approach to history is rather like writing history of hunting. After all, there can only be one history of hunting, that of the hunter, and not of the hunted, unless, of course, one day folks were to write a new history of hunting. If history is only concerned with the victor, then surely Tibet is one of the great losers of history. Today, Tibet does not even appear as a country or nation in World Atlas. There is even pressure from the Chinese government to remove the common noun Tibet that can stand alone. Chinese government objects to the comic book Tintin in Tibet and insists that if the comic were to be sold in China, and the publisher must change the title to Tintin in China's Tibet. And the Chinese language edition of the comic has to be sold in that correct title. The very existence of Tibetan language itself is questioned. Microsoft has to battle whether to use Zongge or Tibetan in the font menu. And in 1980s, the Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping, in his message to the Dalai Lama, said that the past is past, only the future matters. Here again, the pronouncement can only be made by the victor. It is convenient for the victor to discard the past. After all, they can rest on their laurels For the vanquished, it is only resorting to the past they claim for the justice. It appears that one country which seems to proudly proclaim that it has discarded the burden of history is modern China. One of the reasons cited by Chinese intellectuals and parties for the rapid rise of China is that it had discarded the burden of past, and the only future matter mentality has propelled China into economic dominance. And China often, when you talk to Chinese, they often equate that with America. They say America became great because they only had the future and they didn't have to look for the past. They didn't have the burden of the past. So they model themselves on America. So the less history you have, the greater potential to realize the future. Of course, this statement by Chinese leaders and Chinese intellectuals is a disingenuous and fallacy. History matters a great deal to the Chinese. In fact, the core origin of Chinese nationalism and the present nationalistic posturing is based on historical summation of China's past experience. We often hear the Chinese saying, "No one can bully China now." This phrase is positioned on reflection on China's history and memory of what is regarded as China's humiliation in the hands of the West and Japan. Same time, China can genuinely say that past does not matter. After all, no one questions China's right to exist as a nation state. And moreover, who could doubt the splendor of Chinese past? When we talk about history as something that matters, it can only be seen from the larger context of being and its relation to now and then. For a vanquished people, history becomes something more than an event in the past. Here, history is never simply about facts about the past. It has to do with the memory, mythology, remembering, stories, and landscape. The gap between memory and history is raised to produce a passage from there to here. If memory is mythic and timeless, history is rational organization of the past. In pre-modern Tibet, we lived in a reservoir of memories. But today, as a colonized subject, Tibetans are in search of history. Even history as a discipline and academic crafts cannot discard the power of memory and mythology in formation of people's idea of their past. History is always about configuring and conjoining related or unrelated past events into continuous present. All the peoples and nations have their own mythic past, and historians can show that the mythic past is constructed and false consciousness, but cannot deny its power and its way it seizes hold of people's mind. Tibetans believe the land of Tibet is a realm blessed by the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara. But this is a myth, but it has a powerful hold on the people's imagination and their notion of the past. This is not similar to American myth that America is the world's oldest democracy. This fallacy forms an important constituent of the American self-image of their history. Every nation and people conflates memory and different modes of remembering to produce a history of themselves. This type of history forms the base of a nationalistic history and popular history that sways the people into action. Of course, professional historians can always distance themselves from this type of history and appeal to the altar of rationality and the body of theories to arrive at their summation. Moreover, professional historians can say history is based on analysis and criticism, while memory defies analysis and resists criticism. When the past is contested, mythic past takes a new significance. If past does not exist, there can be no present. Without present, there is no future. In this context, let me now turn to the history of Tibet and see how Tibetans are practicing the craft of history. Whether we argue the English term history has or has not generic equivalents in Tibetan language is a matter of debate. Certainly, the idea of antecedents and notion of something that happened in the past, which has a bearing on the present, is an important aspect of Tibetan literary and oral practice. Let me quote a Tibetan oral proverb. It says, you know, trees have roots and people have history. Again, in another sort of Lang Buddhist Siru, one of the history of chronicles of Lang family, it begins with this quote: "If humans does not know his ancestry, it is, he is no better than monkey in the forest. If one does not know one's lineage, one is like a defective turquoise dragon. If one doesn't know customs of forefather, one will fade into ignorance." Here, both in the sort of folk wisdom and in the chronicles, it has sort of emphasis on valuing the past. The folk wisdom defines and equates humanness as a possessing history. As there can be no tree without roots, so there can be no human without history. Another level, the folk wisdom clearly values recording of the past, and that it argues that history does matter. When we examine the body of Tibetan literature, we find there are a host of genres that are related to narratives about the past. There's Gerab, Chujung, Gerab, the Chronicles of King, Chujung, Origins of Religion, Tetars, Annals, Tungrabs, Genealogy, Lugyu, History or Stories, or Denrab, History of Holy Places or Monasteries, and Kenrab, Histories of Abbots. So you can go on. There's a whole sort of list of Tibetan literary practices which deals with the recording of the past. And of course, there's namdars and its other subgenres, and of course, we can debate whether namdar constitutes a historical narrative or not. So we can question whether all these sort of traditional narratives really constitute history. As we know, we now understand, as we understand the discipline of history, the traditional genres lack the rigor of modern praxis. These narratives, at the best, can be regarded as sources of history and not a history. We may argue that these narratives about the past are constructed and selective and has no value as analytical history. This also raises the question of historical consciousness. What type of consciousness is revealed in these traditional genres? Here, I'm not concerned with the veracity and the authenticity of what is being narrated, but what they have all in common is that they constitute some form of recording of the past, retelling of events, explaining where it is now. And now it is a recording of the past to arrive at the present. This form of recording clearly attests to the fact that Tibetans valued history, and history did matter to them. Otherwise, why devote so much energy and labor retelling the past? They told the past that mattered to them. The existence of a vast body of literature devoted to the past is indelible evidence that people who compiled them valued the recording of the past. These recordings are composed at different times and circumstances. It is unlikely the Lama scholars who produced these texts would have ever imagined that one day the very existence of Tibet would be questioned. It is one thing to say culturally Tibetans valued history, but another thing to say history mattered. As noted earlier, history mattered to those who are product of the history. Today, history of Tibet matters even more so than did in the past to the Tibetans. For them, what is at the stake is not just Tibet's past, but also the future. In 1980s, Inside Tibet saw the reprinting of all texts utilizing modern printing technologies. They reprinted all texts in thousands, and unseen and rare texts were brought to the public eyes for the first time. I do not know the exact number of that is being reprinted, but there is still the process is going on about reprinting of all texts. To me, this labor seems entirely devoted to resurrecting Tibet's past. The text becomes evidence of Tibet's present. The reprinting of the books led to the growing demand for Tibetan language rights in the 80s. even if Tibetan nation does not exist in the political reality, books gave a textual reality to Tibetan self. In this same context, Tibetans today seem to be far more interested in past than ever before. When we look at the types of history that are being produced before and later, we can see definite shift in historical narrative. At simple level, we can say the past historical writings were predominantly Chunjung, the origins and development Buddhism, and the last great sort of Chunjung was Tönjung Rinpoche's Nyingma Chunjung. But both inside Tibet and among exile, almost all publications now from 1950 tend to be predominantly political and secularized history rather than religion. Then there are other forms of remembering narratives, from collections of proverbs, anthologies of folk songs, village marriage customs, groups of village sponsoring books on local history, and in the Tibetan diaspora, Kituk, the mutual aid association sponsoring histories of their homeland. In fact, much of the literary production among Tibetans seems to be to do with some form of engagement and recording on collecting about the past. This process is transforming what was once only remembered only in the mind into concrete evidence of the past tradition, and it creates a textual commemorative monument for the past. The process of creation of monument archives occurs because past is threatened. It is being erased, and new colonial edifices are transforming the landscape. The obsession with the recording and conserving also exhibits subjects' anxiety in itself. Anxiety. It is self-conscious attempt to remember. In the past, the Tibetans never felt need to record hundreds of proverbs and folk songs, but today much labor is spent in collecting, recording. This is because it was a reality and formed a part of daily life and practice in the past. But today, these have to be created as a monument of the past. This form of remembering does not constitute a history. There are materials stored in libraries and archives waiting the scrutiny of historians. The collection of proverbs and folk songs and biographies of the muleteers, the farmers, soldiers, and ordinary monks in the monastery are being arduously compiled as a defense lawyer collects evidence to furnish before court. Of course, these collections are imperfect and selective, may be contaminated archives. My point is not about veracity and authenticity as said before, but stress the process of memorialization and the transformation process that is taking place in the Tibetan society. In fact, past that is recorded demonstrate a shift in the way we archive memory. In pre-modern Tibet, the recollection of the past was mainly predominantly religious figures. Today, past that being compiled is of secular figures. As far as I know, there are only few accounts of secular figures in the pre-modern Tibet, while accounts of religious figures can be counted in hundreds. Today, most producers of the past account are secular figures in form of biographies or family history, while there is reticence to produce numbers of lamas. If we look at the number of highly respected lamas and tulkus that have been passed away in recent years, no numbers have been produced. Over the dinner, I was checking this with Jean and saying whether Tönjung Rinpoche and Tijan Rinpoche and Zemir Rinpoche and Kamapa, 16th Kamapa, whether their numbers have come out and printed. And actually, in the traditional Tibet, these numbers, 16 Kamapa number would have been printed and would be distributed. Yet there is some complexity in producing such number, because I think this is some uncertainty, even among the religious community. Reticence. This is because how do you write about the we live in a skeptical age, and the number is full of mystical and fantastical. And in this skeptical age, how do you write a number? with Lama, which shows both mystical and fantastical without being ridiculed. So there is a problem about writing Namdal. So whereas a lay people can always write about their ordinary lives because it's, you don't have to say you flew between two mountains. But this also is having a fact. There's different things are remembered now and in the past. It's also changing what we regard as a Tibet, what we see as our past. This transformation of remembrance past seems to imply burden and memory become responsible of each individual, and their past lives becomes worth writing about. And the other thing is in the traditional Tibetan society, there are very few biographies on accounts of women, female figures. But today, there are more women writing their biographies. One level, when you look at the things which are published in English, but also in Tibetan language. Actually, there is incredibly large number of women writing their biographies, from aristocratic ladies to political prisoners, to people who escaped from Tibet. There's a huge attempt to remember their past. So there's a different people's lives is being valued and their past is valued as having some common reflection on all of us. Here, I don't want to say this writing of ordinary Tibetan is somehow Tibetans are sort of forging new form of subaltern history where voices of traditional martyrs are being heard. What is interesting is they're not writing subaltern history. What they're writing is a collective history. When you read this biography, often where they generalize, where they talk about their common experience, Tibet becomes a general landscape. You know, it's beautiful snowy mountains and the grassland and the river. You know, often lacking specificity in their details in account. They talk about generalized common, where they talk about a collective in this remembering of past in this writing. So it's somehow it's not individual past is remembered, but it's somehow collective past is remembered. This archival project reflects the loss of tradition. What was once spontaneous and lived experience today has to be stored in text. Both inside Tibet and outside, Tibetans compiling their memory as evidence of their past. The Library of Tibetan Works and Archives in Dharamsala has produced a series of books on lives of former Tibetan officials to ordinary monks and people. The Amna Machin Institute in Dharamsala has also produced histories of local histories of Kham areas and rare biographies of individuals. And similarly, there is same process is happening, and in fact, what is remembered, how to remember, there is almost a sort of contest between what is produced in exile and what is produced inside. There is almost what is to be that? What is that past that remembered? When Chinese encourage a peasant and serf who has suffered a great deal, he is asked to remember this past suffering of Tibet, to reflect as a Tibet past as something dark and something to be turned away from. Whereas in the past that is encouraged to remember in exile is something idyllic, which to be cherished, something which we return to. So there is a absolutely sort of competition to even to archive Tibet's memory in certain ways. The Chinese government encourages collection of local histories to anthologies of proverbs, but they reserve the right to interpret for their own designs. The archival project in Tibet are undertaken under colonial license. Problematic it may be, nevertheless, Tibetans are enthusiastically writing. Colonial stricture brings its own contradiction. Tibetans sees this publication and collection as a visible sign of Tibet past and distant from China, while Chinese sees this as emancipation of Tibet. While these projects of storing the past is diffused into collective recollection and individual responsibility, there are those who are engaged in another form of writing about the past, which seek to give Tibet a form to Tibetan nation. As many scholars and theorists have noted the correlation between historical consciousness and with the concept of nation. Ernest Renan pointed out the heart of nationalistic writing is about search for alternative identification. Nation replaces other forms of identifications. Anthony Smith, another writer on nationalism, argued that the process of nationalistic writing becomes a surrogate religion which aims to overcome the sense of futility endangered by removal of any vision of existence after death, and by linking individual to persisting community whose generations form the indissoluble link in a chain of memories and identity. This project of historicization of Tibetan nation began long ago, yet it's crystallized after Tibetan displacement in 1950. One of the first attempts to resurrect Tibetan nation is Gundun Chömbel in his Teptar Kabo White Annal. It is no accident the book is perhaps one of the most reprinted and widely read of all Gundun Chömbel's work. And Heather Stoddard, in her biography of Gundun Chömbel, tells us that one of the books that Tibetan delegation who went to negotiate with China in 1950, in the Teptar Kabo was one of the books they took with them. And you think, what did the history book about the 7th and 8th century going to help in 1950 negotiating with the communist China? You know, I don't know how a book about the imperial Tibet in 7th and 8th century was going to help them. But idea seems that the book attests to Tibet's past autonomy and present right for independence. Gundun Chömbel's unfinished book has found a new readership and is one of the most cited books among Tibetans. Popularity of the book is because the subject matter. It harks back to a time when Tibet was a strong imperial power. Image of strong Tibet provides sustenance to present fragility. This seems to me the core of nationalistic aspiration and reading of history. Then there are those who are in search of even grander history of Tibet, producing narratives that traces the rise and fall of Tibet, and again, to reshape the Tibetans' image of themselves. This search for Tibetan antiquity has given new lease of life among Tibetan scholars, and particularly re-evaluation and also, I think, new legitimacy, status accorded to Pön religion, which was once portrayed as enemy of Buddhism, has now found a new respectability among Tibetan. Pön is no longer seen as purely in negative light, but as an authentic source of Tibet and Tibetanness. The real or supposed antiquity of Pön gives Tibet authentic antiquity that where its repository of Tibetan self resides. This has strong pull among the Tibetan readers. When we look at the writings of Namgyal Nobu, Tibet's antiquity becomes essential for understanding and locating source of Tibetan self, and it provides a means of saving Tibet. Namgyal Nobu has devoted and cultish followers among Tibetans, both inside and outside, and also among his Western followers. His writings, originally addressed to Tibetan diaspora youth, has now been reprinted in Tibet and then found a new fertile readership. In preface to one of his books, Nobu puts it like this: the Tibetan people and culture may be destined to vanish. the only way to save the identity of people is to preserve its culture. In order to praise the culture of the country, to enable to survive, it is necessary to search for genuine roots, which in Tibet's case undoubtedly derive from the ancient Pön tradition and civilization of Shangshung. This search for ancient root of Tibetan culture allows Namgyal Nobu to position Tibet as a product of autonomous Tibetan self that is pure and not contaminated by external sources. When I ask Tibetan readers why they like Namgyal Nobu's writing, invariably the answer is that he expands or he extends Tibetan history by several thousand years, demonstrating Tibetan antiquity. This view is made in context of China. In fact, one of Namgyal Nobu's book posits it is possible that disciples of Dampa Shirab might have taught Confucian, and that China might have been recipient of Tibetan wisdom and culture. Nobu's attempt to locate Tibet itself in antiquity has wide appeal among Tibetans, particularly those inside Tibet who always view Tibetan self in relation to Chinese others. A search for Tibetan antiquity becomes an answer to accusation of lacking history. If Nobu's project is to give Tibetan sense of longevity and antiquity, other writers seek Tibetan self also that resides in continuity. Samdang Kamla has suggested that Tibetan nationhood as existing in the past and the subsequent history has been slow erosion of national identity. He writes, the concept of national identity in Tibet was much more clearly expressed in ancient time than, say, the Middle Ages, while the advent of Buddhism, and particularly from the 11th century onwards, the national consciousness of Tibetan people suffered greatly. Samdang does not advocate return to ancient times. However, implication is clear. If Tibetan nation is to be saved, it is only recourse to history and past, and is the only alternative. Like Namgyal Nobu, Samdang also sees continuity in formation of Tibetan identity that goes beyond Buddhist rhetoric. His examinations of Tibetan rituals of mountain cult and Lungta and Sang offerings and origins of ancient Tibetan all attest to continuity and finds elements that binds Tibetan national identity that is rooted in the land and gives roots to the social formation of national identity. My focus is on Namgyal Nobu and Samdang Kama. Is not an attempt to privilege Tibetans writing outside. Indeed, Tibetans in Tibet are writing a great deal and have produced a number of interesting and problematic texts. But Namgyal Nobu has acquired a unique position, and his work has a wide readership inside Tibet. Samdang Kama's work is produced in a different milieu and readership, and his discussion stems from Western academic interest in the sacred landscape and power places. However, in the last few years, his work has found a new readership inside Tibet, and his subject of his book has become a topic of discussion among Tibetan graduate students in Tibet. Almost all the works of Samdang has been translated and reprinted in Tibetan, and the new community of readers have embraced his idea. In Tibet, his work is seen as more authentic and truthful, mainly because it's both Namgyal Nobu's and Samdang Kamla has a strong follower in Tibet. For particular reason is, firstly, the public sees their work as produced outside the colonial surveillance. It's not under Chinese structure their work is produced. Secondly, they are both associated with the Western academic institution that gives them enormous prestige and respectability of their work. So while of course there are many Tibetans inside who have written, but somehow they are sort of seen as pure, who are writing authentic, and they have the legitimacy authority of West associated with the Western academia and the university. So that's why these two work, appealing to the past and the ancient antiquity of Tibet and the continuity of Tibet from the ancient period to today, has a very strong emotional appeal to the Tibetan people. While Namgyal Nobu and Samdech Karma differ greatly in their approach, there is an underlying theme, to borrow a phrase from Prasenjit Dogra, who termed the authentic core essence. For Nobu and Samdech Karma, history becomes search for core essence of Tibetan self that is not only present today, but existing in antiquity and, more importantly, recited in folk wisdoms and tradition. They tend to look at the, not on the traditions of great religious learnings, but on the folk ritual traditions as the repository of Tibetan self and identity. And here is the almost sort of communing with the whole sort of Tibetan nation and the common people. If Tibet is to be saved, then Tibet's core essence must be first identified and cherished. This search for ancient roots finds voice in all forms of debate in Tibet taking place today. For example, in the Tibetan, this another form, this debate is reflected in discussions about literature. What is good literature? What is authentic Tibetan literature? And Tibetans say anything Tibetans produce after publication and translation of Datan's Kavita Desrat, Nyanga Melong, is not Tibetan. We've been constrained by Nyanga Melong, and really to liberate Tibetan literature, we must go back to Golus and folk songs to that. So here is a sort of another level is sort of opposing any kind of external sources, to go really to look to the roots, even in the literature, that now we must look to the ancient Kulus and folk songs for what is really authentically Tibetan literature. So I think this is the foundation of nationalism lies in the resurrection of unsullied past. The ancient of nation history is seen as a reflection of the greatness of its origin and testifying present claims of justice. Again, this search for the Tibetan antiquity and this is also ancient root has another sort of interesting implication in Tibet. There are those who argue that the Tibet's search for core essence of history is deliberately encouraged and employed by the Communist Party to de-link Tibet with Buddhism and stress foreignness of Buddhism. In fact, the previous party secretary, Ten Quyen, made such a remark. He said communism is no more foreign than Buddhism, which also came from outside. This is the reason the party turns blind eye to the protection of these texts when it's dealing with Tibet and search for ancient history. This also reflects the contradictory nature of colonial rule. As we know from emergence of various forms of third world nationalism, that the colonist concretization of race, caste, religion, and tribes often formed the source of nationalistic movement. When I asked Tibetan Insight why you are writing about ancient past only and not concerned about the recent past, the quick response is often, well, if you write about events that happened long time ago, the party is unconcerned. And while if you write about something recent past, it becomes problematic. This pragmatic strategy is true when we examine Tibet's recent past, say the 17th century history of Tibet is hotly contested. While Chinese leaders may say past is past and only think of the future, when it comes to Tibet's history, he plays a very important part in their thinking. As I mentioned, the Tibetans inside Tibet are producing great deal of books on history. In fact, those who study Tibetan language at university level there are only two subjects they can study, that namely native language, literature, and history. And this is the paradox, I find it in Tibet. This is the very sort of that the Tibetans at the Northwest Minority Institute in Langzhou, and Qinghai, and Lhasa, or Beijing, they are forced to study only Tibetan history and literature. And literature and history are called the two ingredients of nationalism. Literature to valorize the landscape, and history to reflect on your greatness. You know, and this is are the two subjects that are only alternate available for the Tibetans to study. But writing Tibetan history in China today is like trying to fit square peg into round hole. There's a party stricture to find every possible linkage between Tibet and China, which means treating Tibet as the history of Tibet as extension of China. In recent historical textbooks from Tibet, traditional periodization is dispensed with, and the events in Tibet are explained through the Chinese dynastic history. Then the Tibetan historians have to work under the imposed orthodoxies of Marxist historiography, which stress the evolution of primitive society to socialist society. In both cases, the history is to show the inevitability of Tibet's merger with China, and does not allow any sort of intrusion which questions the Chinese right to govern Tibet. In fact, much of the historical writing in Tibet is to prove historical veracity of China's right. Similarly, Tibetans in exile also engage in narrow concerns about history, that is to show Tibet's legitimacy as a nation. In such climate, writing of history becomes a minefield. In 1990, a young Tibetan scholar in Beijing called Chapka Dorje wrote an article which questioned the civilizing mission of the Tang Dynasty Chinese princess who married the Tibetan emperor. Generally, in the Chinese historiography and Tibetan she is treated as a great civilizing influence on Tibet. She introduced agriculture and a whole host of arts and crafts. And Chapka Dorje questioned that assumption. He was summarily dismissed from his job and ended up as a teacher back in his village. Similarly, there is another scholar called Dorje who wrote an article about comparing tribute missions sent by Lhasa to Nepal to Lhasa to China. Clearly, it's memory. If Tibet sent tribute mission and Tibet was part of China, similarly, Tibet equally sent the same number of tribute missions to Nepal, so Tibet could also be part of Nepal. So although he never suggested such a thing, but he did write this article, also he lost his job. But this not just only happens in China, but even in the exiled community, there is some discomfort in dealing with the critical and analytical history or historical approach to issues. For example, in the 1990s, again, Samdek Kamala wrote an article on reassessment of King Langtharma, which is generally demonized as anti-Buddhist and terrible, bringing disaster to Tibet. And Samdek questions that sort of traditional characterization. The Dharamsala Tibetan Library and Work and Archives did not publish it, and in fact, it became a major sort of discussion among the Kashak, and the book was, the article was banned. And in the earlier periods, there's other works by Tsutum Kankar, who is in Japan. He wrote a not really good book on the history of Tibet, but generally these articles are not really good as a historian, but sometimes they bring some idea, and which upsets a lot of people about this. So any some kind of questioning or of orthodoxies and establishment which doesn't glorify the past often finds a very creates a discomfort and anxiety among Tibetans. But nevertheless, I think it is not Tibetan history is, despite saying that there are anxiety, but I think Tibetans are remarkably tolerant about historical discussion of things, and clearly most are aware of some of the major issues that they're debated. You know, there is no sort of situation in Tibetan case where publication of history led to major riots or things. It's not like James Lane's Shivaji and Hindu King in Islamic India, which caused nationwide riots in India, and which even Indian government under Prime Minister Vajpayee ordered the author to be arrested by the Interpol. So Tibetans do not have not reacted in such a way to some of the debate. I mean, some of the historical debates going around both in Tibet and among Tibetans, whether this is Sangye Gyatso is son of fifth Dalai Lama. It may sound very sacrilegious to most Tibetans, yet at the same time it does not cause that kind of emotional riots where the demanding authors to be arrested or assassinated. So there is room for some measure of discussions taking place within Tibetan. One time I was talking to Sambo, who was aristocrat, and I said, why do you tolerate talking so openly about history? And he said to me, what he meant was, it's all set, it's all done. Because he said during the Chinese communist regime period, they have to reveal everything, they have to open everything, confess to everything. So he said, there's nothing to hide anymore. So he said that made it sort of more easier to talk about not only of the recent past, but of the old. So there is a genuine, some extent, reflection in Tibet today among the discussions about history and how it's related. But at the same time, I think history matters to Tibetan because it's fundamentally, it relates to the question of justice. You know, whether we as an individual, we as a nation, we all sort of have some sense of ourself or our worthiness through reflection of our past. And this is a sense Tibetans today face with the question of their identity and their nationhood. And that is only through history that they can seek their justice for their current situation. So therefore, the history and question of language of justice, I think it's very much linked to the Tibetan people. And not just the Tibetan people, I think it's when it's question of history is tested, and there's a question of justice is also involved. It is sort of for black people's claim for social justice is made in context of history of discrimination. Similarly, women's claims is situated in the context of marginalization of women in the past. So we see the Tibetans making claim for justice based and reflection on their past. Therefore, for the people who history is denied, their history does matter. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you.
So we have some time for questions.
I'm curious if you could just talk about, what it's like to go into Tibet and ask people these questions, how long you have to know people before they are comfortable enough to talk about, these things, or, how sensitive it is for you to go in that conversation.
In Tibet, it depends on the location. Really, it's sometimes when you're in Beijing, it becomes quite easy because the Tibetans are living in isolated apartments and they're far away from other sort of community. So you could be any visitor to their apartment. So you could be sitting there and talking about history, and they can talk quite openly. Further west you go into Tibet, it's more problematic. It becomes, if you are in Lhasa, it becomes extremely problematic. You know, it's just everyone are very polite. They talk, but you know, it takes a long time to know these people. Fortunately for us, I know most of the people who work on sort of scholars and researchers, people interested in literature or sort of intellectual Tibetans. I know them from now over the last 10 years. So it becomes, you build up trust and it becomes easier. But it is, but some aspect, Tibetans themselves are writing, they are discussing themselves. And you can read from their exchanges in the book. But they don't write in sort of very open way, but you have to read in between the lines of what is being said about in this text. You know, actually, I mean, I didn't talk about the very interesting, would be said like, looking at the Chabchidem Pinjo's 3-volume book, History of Yurtang. I mean, it's very interesting. It's supposed to be a response to Shagaba's book, you know. But when you look at the Shagaba wrote the book, when he wrote the book, he didn't have access to some of the sources, Tibetan sources, he says he doesn't, and he quotes from memory, and which sort of supposed to prove Tibetan. But then Chabi has a very strange thing. He quotes the entire thing in full there and leaves it without sort of saying directly a thing. And then Tibetan people say, Tibetan, and they say, Chabi did Shagaba Sore numbers. And this is Chabi's gift to Shagaba. They say, instead he left it in the book as a full text, so now Shagab can actually consult the source. So they say Chavik Sore numbers. You know, so it's a, I mean, don't know whether this is true or not. That's how people tell you what happened to that things. So it's quite complicated in that. Yeah.
What was Tibetan reaction to your book? Driving the language.
It's Tibetans, you know, Tibetans are like everyone, you know, for most Tibetans, it's particularly young people in the Western, going in the Western universities, studying in Berkeley, or you know, they find it very grateful because they say, why didn't we know all about this thing? Why? How come nobody told us this? You know, it sort of comes as a revelation to them. And for Tibetans in the diaspora, large community, they say, it's terrible, you know, you're imitating Westerners and dedicating your book to your wife, not to the Dalai Lama. They say, that's terrible. You know, so you get that sort of criticism, and some people say, you know, you use the word Dalai Lama, why don't you say His Holiness the Dalai Lama? So you get really sort of quite intelligent comments to very silly sort of comments like that.
Maybe Tibet?
Pardon? Tibet, I mean, it's available in Chinese, and it's a lot of Chinese sort of people who read Chinese in Tibet, they read it. And again, I mean, it has been reviewed in journals in China, and both in China's Tibetology and I think they reviewed it. So this is again same thing. He says he's okay, but he's still a reactionary. They say.
It seems to me that Gilman Shaka's books are very important, not just for the Tibetans, but also if you want to know Tibetan history.
Yeah.
When I'm a Tibetan, and I went to Tibetan school in India, I've never heard about Gilman Shaka before. How come we are not taught Gilman Shaka's books, or how come we really don't know about
And the school textbooks in Tibetan language textbooks in Tibetan schools in India, I think it stops somewhere in the 10th century. It doesn't go, it's just, then history gets complicated. It's just to have it stops at the actual assassination of Langdharma. It stops at the history textbook, stops there. So that was the 8th century. So, you know, we are only taught about that, the glorious imperial past, and not about the very complicated things about religious views and religious things. Very little is taught among Tibetans. And that is part of sort of inculcating sense of nationalism. You know, we are taught a great deal about Songtsen Gampo and the spread of Dharma and the origins of Tibet as land of Bodhisattva. This in all our textbooks we do. But then it stops at after Langdharma. Yeah.
So, I was thinking, you spoke about Tibetans harking back to the imperial age to find an escape, you know, from this very frustrating reality of now. I was wondering if you also see in that like some kind of, for example, when the Tibetans talk about the militaristic glory of the ancient past, but in that, do you see them sort of finding a competing voice to the dominant, like say the Dalai Lama's voice on the current political, in the current political struggle for freedom, which is sort of not like, you know, heading toward any concrete direction. So do you see like any kind of sort of like self-serving oneself with, I mean, either delusional or like, you know, reality-based?
No, it's two things. There's, I think what people like Samdhenla Namgyal Nobu, and particularly Namgyal Nobu, his sort of project is very different. He really wants to create Tibet that is so ancient and authentic and old, and it's not defiled from outside influences. He wants to look for something which pure Tibet, and he thinks that can be resurrected there. And it's not, you know, for him, even in Tibet, Songtsen Gampo period is too new. We have to go beyond that, you know, that. I mean, he extends Tibetan history by about 3,000 years. You know, that is his aim. He's looking at something very primordial and pure essence of Tibet. So this is not about the, even about the martial period. Versus, things with Samdhenla talks, he talks in a very complex way. It's not a, Samdhenla is very sophisticated and a complex approach there. But what he sees is a continuity. When we do Sanso, when we do Lungda, he sees this not as rooted in something in recent invention of Buddhism, but something that goes beyond Buddhism and that tradition. And you know, that is the continuity of the Tibetans. So, so again, here for him, is continuity is essential. That Tibet always existed, and that exists in these rituals. And this is the one which mountain cults. When he talks about nationalism, and he talks sort of field work and looks at the Lapsu mountain cults, Latse, these things, and he sees that's a sort of core of Tibetan national identity and unifier of Tibetan nationalism. Not these martial things about glories, what Songtsen Gampo achieved.
A couple of years ago in Beijing, an interesting collection of articles on archaic and ancient Tibet was published. It was an anthology of about 90 articles that had appeared over the years on the subject of ancient Tibetan materials. And I believe the introduction of the volume was written by Yago. And one of the interesting things for me that emerges in that volume is it's one of the few places where I've noticed the beginnings of a debate about the methodology of historical study. Yeah. Not the ideology, not the question of what we should believe or not, but how historical research should be conducted. To what extent do you see that as developing among Tibetan historians more broadly, both in the exile community and in the PRC? And what do do you see as the role of that questioning of methodology in the development of Tibetan historical thinking?
I think that's very important, because at the moment, for example, like Namgyal Nobu talks about origin of Tibetan script and Shangshung sort of thing existing before Timisamboda. And he conjures up some form of script. He says these are what Shangshung letters are like. But for historian, of course, we have to say, where's the evidence? You know, unless we have an archaeological dig and find a tablet on the stone or finds an ancient text, no one going to say, it's sort of his vision of this is the evidence of existence of Shangshung writing. You know, and so there is actually there is no sort of historical thing. I mean, Namgyal Nobu is a sort of a visionary. Like his writings are paptung, you know, paptung, pap and trung. You know, it's sort of inspired writing. It's not a really sort of historical in sort of approach. But other people who have approach, I mean, Thunduk Gyal is a good approach. You know, his analysis of Kurlu and his analysis, translation of Tang chronicles into Tibetan, this really, there's a consistent and concerned with the faithfulness of the translation and doing. So there are certain individuals who are interested in looking at the material at hand and examining, not sort of visioning about what might have been in the past. But no, there aren't really serious sort of discussion about history as discipline or developing particular form of methodology. I don't think there is a discussion. And of course, a big problematic thing is this imposed methodology of Marxist orthodoxy in Tibet, which they have to conform to. You know, that's why you have a Tongaren Mujin's sort of this Chusi Sungten. It's really sort of strange sort of work. It just doesn't fit.
As we have said, since 1980s, many of the books have been published from Tibet. And in fact, since 1980s, more Tibetan books have been published from Tibet than outside Tibet. However, many of these books have, like the one which have been published from Tibet, has some confirmation with Chinese translation and things like that. And at the same time, the book that's being published from India has some confirmation with Indian words within this. What implication do you see in the long run as far as Tibetan literary history is concerned?
No, one amazing thing, books published in Tibet, even in the modern literature, one of the really remarkable things is Tibetans, most people in Tibet today are intellectuals or educated are bilingual. And when you're talking in everyday life conversation, they tend to use a lot of Chinese words, you know, and a lot of loan words enter. But when you read their book, they never ever use loan words, Chinese. And they are really conscious about letting that sort of loan words intrude into Tibet, except for very, very contemporary events, something like they have to refer to Party Tushi or Shotan or Dodan. These are titles that the communists think they have to use. Otherwise, I tend to see this text as a purely Tibetan train, which is not defiled by foreign others. And in terms of books published from Tibet, language-wise, they really resist use of loan words in there. And in fact, that is one of the things what I've been writing about. Sometimes they're supposed to, in the modern literature, short stories, supposed to create realism. But when you read these things, it's not realistic, a real reflection of life, because in life there are always mixing languages, and language has changed. But in the I mean, even, of course, Shakespeare is not realistic. You know, everybody nurse is speaking in verse and everything. But similarly, we find this sort of modern Tibetan literature. Everybody speaking in verse and speaking fantastic, wide vocabulary. But it doesn't happen. You know, that's why you have the reality and the text doesn't meet. And there's a conscious attempt to keep text as purely Tibetan.
former Soviet Union, the academic situation was much the same, that people were encouraged to do linguistics and history and not philosophy or religion. But it seems that the political commissar only read the first few pages of books, and that after the first few pages one can pursue one's own methodology. It would seem to be, the situation seemed to be different in China. Perhaps the availability of computers that enables them to scan a whole book for deviant methodologies.
Yeah. So I didn't understand the question.
Oh, in the former Soviet Union, also one had to adhere to a certain methodology doing linguistics and history.
Yeah.
But it seems that the censors or the political commissar only read the first few pages of the book, in which the author would quote Marx and Lenin and Stalin, and that afterwards the author was free to pursue his own methodology.
Yeah.
So it would seem that in China, on the other hand, the censors read the entirety of the book.
No, not really. I mean, it's again, it's in each situation. I mean, 2003, I went to all the Tibetan language publishing houses in Tibet, from Qinghai Nationality Publishing House to Guangzhou, and was meeting with them, saying, why were you able to publish certain books and why weren't you published? And it's always, there's never sort of clear-cut party policy. It's always depend on whoever happens to be the party secretary at the time. Sometimes the party secretary happens to be Chinese who doesn't know Tibetan, and he said, oh, just give me a draft translation. And sometimes the party secretary is really conscious. He says, I want to see the entire translation before I approve of it. And sometimes you have a Tibetan party secretary who doesn't read Tibetan, and he says, oh, you've got to explain every page to me. And then he sort of becomes... So it always depends on the knowledge, the character of the party secretary. And other thing in the censorship in Tibet and in China is also it's to self-censorship. You know, before you could ever submit a book to that reached level of publication, you must be pretty certain it's going to be published. Otherwise, you can be in trouble.
Reflecting on, I thought if we had to talk to maybe 10 educated Tibetans, even one will have a difficulty in saying what Hong exactly is, unless he or she is from that community. So we know next to nothing about Hong. And so I would think maybe Nandino has got a little bit more kind of things than we think he is. So maybe some of what he said may not be sensible. Maybe it's based on certain facts, but it's not out to the general public. Just a comment on the question.
Yeah. Well, I mean, his language is brilliant. When he analyzes language, it's so sophisticated, so sort of he just these somersaults, and he thinks, so it's very hard to follow. He says these languages are pronounced in a certain way in a certain period, and he says this is how it's spelled. You know, I mean, it's very even in Tibetan when you read this, it's very persuasive. It's very rhetorical. It's very emotional way he writes, and that's what it appeals to a lot of people. It could be possible, and you know, but yeah, sort of Buddhist cultural revolution in Tibet. Yeah, no. I mean, anything could be possible, you know. But you know, but in history, you can always find some archaeological evidence. You find some sort of things, you know. We said in the 1960s, Chinese Cultural Revolution destroyed thousands of books, but still we are still finding a lot of books that were hidden that are coming out today. So what in the Shangshung is existed, and they say it's in the Western Tibet, you know, there could be archaeological site or things, and which they say it's Shangshung archaeological site, but it's really different, distinguished, hard to distinguish from Buddhist sites.
We have one more question. Yeah. Well, I guess two.
You mentioned that the lamas who passed away recently, that these life stories are not written anymore by Tibetans, and your explanation was that it's difficult to write about miracles in our modern time, but could you also imagine that Tibetans feel like that these lamas had so many contacts with the West, and in Tibet students, that maybe these Western students now write their life stories, and there's maybe no need to write it in Tibetan?
No, because I don't think that they will say. I mean, I don't know, reason why 16 Kamapas number hasn't come out. I mean, there may be a lot of political conflicts and who should write it, what should, but to me it seems interesting. From 1960 on, all these great lamas have passed away, yet no one has, numbers have appeared. And I was asking Jean about this today and saying, Tijan Rinpoche, he's written something and it stops at 1973 or something, then there isn't really another one. But I do think it's maybe do with, but how can you write fantastical and mystical in current age? And I think this may be some doubt on the Lama students, how to merge its traditional genre, and that will still be modern and believable. And there is maybe it's to do with the sponsorship. They don't have money. I mean, all things. I'm just speculating. I don't really saying this is the reason they're not writing.
It's a related question. Has there been any attempt that you know of to find a secular literature in the pre-modern periods, in pre-59? Another way of asking the question is, do you think things like the Kalam Tupcho and the Dorin Pandita are models for contemporary biographical and autobiographical writing?
No, I don't think so. Firstly, as I was saying at the AS meeting, okay, firstly, for Tibetan now today to say, use the term Dokzu to write about their biography sounds so pretentious, No one will use what Dokzu, they just use Mese Lugu or something, is that. Other thing is, it's written in a very different, the Kalyan Dokzu, all this, I think it has much more relation to the notions of aristocracy, notion of service, civility, and all that is there. And in fact, I find reading biographies of English aristocracy, like service to the king and country, this appears very much in Kalyan Doksu and all this. That tradition is there. But today, it is written by, that's what I was telling Jean today, that's really one of the nicest books that Tibetan I came as called Tibet Lugyu. And this guy, Tibet is a muleteer's life story. And this guy who was a muleteer in 1930s, 40s, going from Lhasa to Kalimpong, he's written this wonderful life about this life. It's like muleteers at that time were like the truck drivers going on the freeways, and he's written this life, And where in Tibet would we have found such, in period in Tibetan literature, find history like that? Some muleteer has written his life story. And it's a really fascinating account of it. And so he could not possibly sort of have a sort of Kalyan Doksu as his model or image, saying that I'm anyway comparable, my life is worth the minister's life.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Sarah.